Russell and Metaphysics of Neural Monism. It's a thesis written by not John Hamilton. So he has touched a very interesting topic which deals with the how we basically construct human knowledge as such. The debates of epistemology means how do we know what we know or how much we can know. It's an old as well as continuous yearning of human mind to know or the structure of knowledge, how we can test what we know is what we know. So Bertrand Russell was one of the eminent philosophers who contributed to this question to a good extent. Somehow, the very basic questions of what is mind and what is matter, and how do we perceive these two fundamental realities of mind and matter. So, is mind ultimate or is matter ultimate? So it's also a very old debate. So there have been idealists on the one hand, empiricists on the other hand. So so you could take this question either wise. So you can reduce the reality of entire world in terms of some materiality, some matter, or you can reduce the existence of ultimate materiality of world in terms of some ideation or idea. But there is also some other ground. Maybe there is a middle ground. There is not a middle ground, there is a supposed middle ground which has been, what I should say, which has been rather not discovered, it's an evolution. If you study Bertrand Russell's philosophy, his he started basically he was influenced by his predecessors. He was influenced by Hume. He was influenced by classical empiricism. He was a mathematician, so he had a particular viewpoint in how to view mathematics. As in, there was an underlying logic to mathematics, and how he tried to visualize physics also with regard to mathematics, and how he tried to visualize mathematics, physics with the entire episteme of philosophy as such. So the way he wanted to logicize mathematics, he wanted to physicalize mathematics. He wanted to mathematicize physics in his earlier stages. But if you see his various books, whether he had written this, his knowledge, our knowledge of external world, problems of philosophy. So his statements, to quote it. So what is what is uh, to be paramount, mind or matter? What is the ultimate reality of the universe? Whether it's mind or matter. If you take matter means, so matter, how you appreciate matter, how you have some senses, there are some sense perceptions, how we visualize matter. So how, these sense perceptions ultimately lead to they have some cognitive element which is ultimately being tested by something a priori, which you call as mind or whatever you might call it. So in this question, if you read Russell's various articles, for example, his what he constructs mind and matter, if they are two separate realities. So at different stages he has been, I would not say biased. He had predilections for maybe sometimes going to one extreme and sometimes going mid to middle of the two. In their earliest, for example, so he says, for example, in problems of philosophy, he says on the in the paper on the nature of acquaintance holds a dualistic position in which material and mental substances are two irreducible elements. So he would not want to conflate or combine the two. He says that material substances uh, it holds dualistic position in which material and mental substances are irreducible elements. They have separate realities. So you cannot dissolve one into other or other into the this one. So they might have some realities. So, but there might be a relation how mind and matter can also be related, but they are as separate realities. But in the other book, in the knowledge of external world, he not only denies the notion of material substances, but reduces it to a bundle of sense data. So he takes sense data as primary. And further in his book, the analysis of mind, so what he says, the stuff of world of experience is composed in my belief neither of mind nor matter, but something more primitive than either. Both minds and matter seem to be composite, and stuff of which they are composed or compounded lies in some sense between the two. In a sense above, then both like they have a common ancestry. Means he is trying to find some common middle ground. So mind and matter might have some common origin, or there might be some middle ground. You can trace both the realities of mind and matter to some reality. So he considers the world the entities which are neither mental nor physical. He calls neutral entities as sensations. So following Russell explains sensations are what is common to mental and physical worlds, and they may be defined as intersection of mind and matter. So he arrives at something called sensations, which might explain both this matter. So the earlier Cartesian dualism of Descartes, or tracing reality, if we trace reality to the empiricists, the British empiricists, that reality is ultimately empirical. So he would want to have something called sensations, which are common to both physical and mental. Maybe historically also this it's not Russell. Before Russell also, Ernest Mach, he wanted to categorize world into world of physics and world of psychology, and in his later stages he wanted to somehow develop a he said that there are laws of physical worlds and there are laws of psychological world, psychical world. So he developed a subject called psychophysics. So that was his ultimate aim of unification. How laws of physical world and laws of psychical world, they can somehow be unified. So there have been precedents. There have been people before Russell also, or predecessors of Russell also, who have also dealt with this idea of mind and matter in their own way. Russell, you cannot say Russell is he is in line among them, but the sophistication of Bertrand Russell was that somehow he was not purely an empiricist in the earlier 19th century, and he was not, so he somehow also slightly departed from his predecessors, which included Hume as well as as well as Ernest Mach, in some subtle way, which I'll try to somehow uh, elucidate in the light of this thesis by John Hamilton. So if I'll quote him, he starts with problems of matter. So how Russell describes matter, for example, in his books, Our Knowledge of External World, Analysis of Mind, and Relations of Sense Data to Physics. So how do we basically describe matter? So here what we call sensibilities and what we call matter. So how so he would rather say that, for example, he says that he summarized them into following propositions according to Russell. For example, inference to unsensible. For example, Russell says, for Russell had a famous. He wanted to. He wanted to. He wanted to see himself as if he was a phenomenalist. He appeared to be phenomenalist, but you cannot entirely, according to this author, he might not have been phenomenalist in that strict sense. So, for example, in the relation of sense data to physics, he says that inference to unperceived appearances is not unnatural. So there is some sort of unity. And further, for example, inference into uncensored sensibler seems reasonable and natural. And nevertheless, he would like to exhibit physics as susceptible to interpretation in terms of sense data alone. So this is one going to one extreme. So if there is universe or there is mental world, so what is the universe? Universe is basically how we perceive the universe. How we perceive the universe is in terms of sense perceptions. So here comes the idea of mind or matter. So so we can exhibit physics as susceptible to the interpretation in terms of sense data only. This is one. The other is, he is nevertheless not willing to assert that physics can do without uncensored sensibler in addition to sense data. So even though we have perceived the sense data, but there's also prior to sense data, that's uncensored sensibler. So there's also a background of, so you know something, but you know something, but what you know, what you know when you go to realm of knowing something, does you do what you know, is it independent of what you don't know, the larger subset. So what you know, so is it independent of what you don't know, or it is dependent upon what you know? So here his position is ambivalent. In the third case, nor he is willing to assert at this stage that physics requires uncensored sensibilia in addition to sense data. This is what I'm saying is ambivalent. Until it can definitely be shown that physics can be in terms of sense data alone, it is good to make explicit inferences that one is allowing. Russell allows himself inferences to a sense data of others and uncensored sensible. So he doesn't want to take a position that what you know, if you know perfectly, so it's independent of what you don't know. So it may be dependent or it may not be dependent. So he wants to have an ambivalent position. So our knowledge of external world, that only the occurrence of an expected sense datum is ever strictly verified, so that physics, which claims to be an empirical science, must be susceptible to reformulation in terms of sense data alone. So here, since Russell was a mathematician, so one thing about mathematician, his particular viewpoint, being a mathematician, for example, and logician, feels that he wanted to apply scientific method to philosophy. Being a mathematician, logician feels that applying scientific method to philosophy will cure philosophy of all traditional malaise. So so but the unknown, for example, when you in mathematical structure, different schools of mathematics, particularly the school of mathematics Russell and Whitehead belong. So they want to start with some primitive, see, they want to reduce all mathematics to the logical. primitive logical, some logical underlying logical structure from which you can the edifice of all of. That's true for mathematics, but they want to they he would have wanted to extend this mathematical method to scientific method also in a logical way. But here the game was that how we can construct those primitive postulates was that I think we are interested in the mathematical aspects of logical construction. The ingenuity involved in the construction interest. So Russell was not involved, he's more interested in the mathematics method. See, for him, method was more important. Rather, ingenuity involved in construction itself. He regarded this as a delightful and small the hat out of which one could pull out the rabbit. It was more delightful. And with regard to uncensored sensibilia, there is not the same degree of emotional commitment. So whatever is known, the so if we can reduce the known thing from minimal set of postulates or principles or assumptions like the Occam's razor, in some loose sense where entities must not be multiplied by necessities, he would want to take the known thing can be ultimately should be derived from some minimalistic principles, and the game would be more beautiful or interesting for Russell. So he's not interesting to extrapolate known and the unknown part of the sensibilia in that sense. So he's more as a game he's interested in what we know and how we can arrange or organize that known thing with minimalism, with the sort of minimalism we have. But he also is not totally wanting to do away with what is not known. So his own view is not that of dogmatic phenomenalism. He had suggested merely a preliminary method. Now there are two problems according to the Hamilton. How much of ordinary physics can be stated in phenomenalistic terms? And if physics cannot be stated in such terms, what conceivable principles can be discovered by which we may find ground for belief in them? The second problem cannot be. So this problem of, for example, how much of the physics, it will be true, it was when Russell it was 1930s 40s, after 90 years these questions are still relevant, maybe in our modern day understanding of string theories and theories of quantum gravity, where a lot of people will decry of a lot of mathematical jargon or mathematical constructions which are there uh, in absence of any verifiable or empirical proofs for those constructions. Those games may be interesting, they may be consistent for a lot of physicists, mathematically oriented physicists, but but uh, but physicists who are physically oriented, they don't want to take these constructions those seriously. So in absence of, for example, how much of ordinary physics can be stated in phenomenological terms? If physics cannot be stated in such terms, what conceivable principles can be discovered by which we may find? So there should be some reasons apart from consistency or beauty or order, whatever mathematical constructions are there. So whatever there should be some conceivable principles can be discovered by which we may find ground for belief in them. So his aim was to see how much could be done with the smallest amount of material, and if the material be inadequate, to find where it is inadequate. And he had nothing particular to say about sensibilia, and wanted to get physics stated without assuming them. His real interest was the method. So maybe he is more interested in the how we arrive at the truth rather than the end points. Maybe truth is also maybe how we arrive at construction. That's a problem. That would be, to my understanding. And you can say he would the interpretation in physics at best an intellectual game, and that an honest acceptance of physics demands recognition of unobserved occurrences. So this is a curious passage. Somewhere Russell says that at best phenomenalism is an intellectual game. So he considers this entire thing as an intellectual game. So the times Russell was living in, he was living in the time when general theory of relativity was there. So the people had, so he was aware of the notions, the times in which there was there. The Einsteinian general theory of relativity had been proved somewhat. Those experiments had been there. Even in that process, he had written those books, ABC of Relativity. So he had an understanding of general theory of relativity. And quantum mechanics was also in evolution in those times. So the ideas, the evolutions of the episteme, which Russell was somehow in the process, he was assimilating, or he was somewhat conceptualizing in bits and pieces. So he was also influenced by the physics of the times, the theory of relativity. That's why he made. So he has before he has a particular way of for example in special theory of relativity or in general theory of relativity. So how we can perceive what we call an event, for example. So event in three-dimensional or three dimensions and one dimension of time. So how we can observe event. So one, you can say, innovation or one interjection is how Russell tries to imagine the idea of simultaneity. He has his own way of appreciating, understanding simultaneity. So he has introduced a term called compresence. But that compresence is not what I should say simultaneity in the sense of special theory of relativity. In special theory of relativity, simultaneity, the idea of space and time, which somehow was a transition of Newtonian time, that at a given point in space there is a particular time associated to it. So 2 points in space, how they could how time can be measured. So if two events are to be space-like, so they cannot simultaneously communicate at the same time if they are space-like events, unless you violate causality. But Russell has his own way of appreciating this idea of this simultaneity. He talks of complex compresence. So where there is simultaneity, unless simultaneity we are regarded as a transitive relation. For example, in my a given item in my experience can be simultaneous with A and also with B, but without A and B being simultaneous. So he not only talks of compresence, he also talks of co-punctuality. So and in that process he also tries to visualize time. So he has his own construction of space and time and his own metaphysics which is associated with it. So he is this Hamilton. He has beautiful how the Russellian reformulation of space-time and his introduction of these terms of compresence and co-punctuality. How somehow he could visualize these ideas of sensibility and sense perceptions. How you can visualize an event in that episteme. So that's a novelty which Russell introduced the times he was living in, but in the end chapters, but simultaneously with regard to the quantum theory which was developing. So So there were various latest developments in quantum mechanics, like Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, many worldview of quantum mechanics, and which he is also talking how. So he is saying that somehow Russell's metaphysics, which he was developing, of idea of neutral monism. So you don't go to extreme material, you don't go to extreme ideal. Okay? You want to have a neutral ground where all reality can ultimately be constructed. For example, at one point in time, Russell holds that object of knowledge and subject of knowledge are two distinct and irreducible entities. He was earlier believing it that way, but later, when he introduced the idea of, when he was more predictive, when his predictions were more towards the idea of neutral monism, he wanted to have some middle ground, or he wanted to have some idea, sensibilia, by which you can derive these both ideas through some primitive way. So the developments in, so relativity, he could have some sophistication, but since quantum mechanics was developing those times, so he was not maybe. But the metaphysics he developed, maybe according to the author, he has also devoted some good amount of it to. And it, he is saying that the metaphysics or the episteme which Russell was developing, it's in more concurrence or coherence with the quantum mechanics which later got developed, not the initial years, in the later years. So he finds the ideas of the ideas of uh, EPR, the ideas of not EPR, the ideas of Copenhagen and other ideas not entirely relevant. He finds Russellian metaphysics more in tune with the how quantum mechanics has evolved in later chapters, which I am not going to divulge much. But in the later chapters, what I would rather say that, and particularly in relativity, one good thing is that he is very much interested how it's transitive, comprehensions and transitivity, how they are mutually related. So, so, so I would rather want to come to the end part of the thing. For example, how Russellian, so Russell's idea of, for example, this episteme of having a neutral monism, it was also helped in the ideas of mind body problem, mind body, how we understand mind body problem, but how it was somehow in the initial stages. Russell wanted to be seen as an in the league of classical empiricism, but later on he somehow in a very sophisticated way wanted to he tried to somehow deviate from them. And you can say that Russell was a natural successor of Hume in certain way, but according to this author, Russell was also the skeptical and element in the Humean epistemology. Russell was somehow able to address that question in some significant way. So how he deviated from classical empiricists and how he improvised on Hume, how he bettered Hume in some certain way. So, that is part of Russellian, the way he, when he wrote that book, Human Knowledge, Its Scope and Limits. So which was, according to author, not received that widely as was expected by author, but giving tribute, he quotes John Passmore, who says once characterized Russell's philosophical development as passage from Descartes to Hume epitomized. So he started as a dualist and then was an empiricist, and ultimately he from so this is a passage from Descartes to Hume. So he is part of that tradition. So he went beyond classical empiricism and partially realized a more naturalistic standpoint in conflict with the empiricist premises. So Russell began as an idealist, but most of all as someone who believed that nature of reality could be illustrated by pure reason alone. This is really a pre-critical form of rationalism, which is reminiscent of Leibniz. So Russell himself began to realize his affinity with Hume and his writings, and Hume became more approving. So he, so what I want to just say is that at the end, so 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 how he ultimately the divide of mental and physical, how he ultimately somehow tried to bridge this divide in terms of the epistemological, in terms of his own episteme. For example, so even though he was retaining some fidelity to the empiricist tradition, but he goes beyond the empiricist philosophers like Hume to embrace the idea of epistemological naturalism. And for example, the author says that we need for something like Russell's postulate of non-demonstrative. So he introduced that novelty, so that originality, that Russell postulated this non-demonstrative inference. So he, in the classical induction, so Russell had some problem with induction. He gives examples also. For example, if there's somewhere he, so for example, if when the proving things by example, so it's, so how much is it valid as a system of knowledge? So if you take knowledge as a justified true belief in the traditional sense, how we describe knowledge, not truth or knowledge. Knowledge is the justified true belief is considered knowledge. So how inductive method has limitations in the process of methodology also. So you need to invoke something called principle of non-demonstrative inference. So how he tried to somehow, what I said it, that the problem of mind and the problem of mental and physical, he is saying that mind is not reducible to matter anymore, more than matter is reducible to mind. So one might define mental event as one which is capable of being known without inference. A physical event is one which is capable of being known inferentially. So that's his way of saying. So in his later stages, mature stages, you can say that Russell's theory, mature theory was more naturalistic and less traditionally embraced than is customarily supposed, despite his own stated elegance to the. So overtly, Russell would want to have been taken as an empiricist, but so it would have been, he would have been a nuanced empiricist, not the empiricist in that hardcore sense. So that the idea of neutral monism, you can uh, somehow just it can be still relevant to the times, the way science has evolved from 1780 years, the way science is like string theory and which are being more mathematical. So there are some cosmologists or physicists or astrophysicists or people who say that the in absence of any data in the universe we are having, for example, how much dark matter, dark, and so there are a lot of, so how can we go beyond the canonical canons of knowledge? So should we take that crystallize what we know already and what we don't know? So what we don't know, so how much seriously should we that take? So what we don't know and our constructions of what we know and what we don't know in the idea of these sensibilities, the idea of the constructions of mind and matter, how we know what we know through senses or sense perceptions, through ideations. So how much this realm of unknown is to be taken seriously or not, or what we know, is it to be taken seriously, is it to be taken as a starting point. So Russellian metaphysics or Russellian epistemology, although it is seems to be addressing the issues of human skepticism and a natural here to whom in terms of epistemological naturalism, I would rather say that regarding scientific methodology, regarding it can the even though Russellian methodology is relevant, still, but is relevant still. Oh, so even if we want to address the issues which we are facing in the current times we are living in, it may be a personal opinion, but rather the questions, the methodology of how we have to arrive at a truth. So this how we what we construct what we say truth or knowledge, the the invocation of this the idea of neutral monism is it can be helpful towards that understanding. Okay, thanks.